consistency of care. We have Suzanne Snyder with us today and Megan Trowbridge. They're going to walk us through their P4 project, I believe. So we're excited to have them. If you have any questions, put them in the chat box and I will get those to them at the end.
Great, thank you very much. Welcome everybody, good morning, how are you? Thumbs up from those like, thank you. My name is Megan Trowbridge. I am the Assistant Director at the Center for Disability Resources. We're part of the U of SC School of Medicine. And I am one of the co-leads on the P4 project that we're going to talk about today. And then my other presenter with me is Suzanne Snyder, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hey, good morning, everybody. My name is Suzanne Snyder, and I am on the P4 project with Megan. I'm also the mental health program manager at the South Carolina Department of Education, and I'm excited to be here this morning and glad y'all joined us.
Thank you. Hopefully everybody can see our slides, and I'm looking at the chat. Communities and schools, great. Multilingual learner program, Richland too. Okay, great. So what we're going to talk about today is a pilot initiative that we are working on in Richland 1. However, we have done some work with Richland 2, and we are starting to work with Lexrich 5. But it's based on a national model called Handle with Care. So hopefully everybody can see this, and y'all keep us honest on time. So what is Handle with Care? I'm not sure how many of y'all have heard of Handle with Care, but Handle with Care is a notification system to identify children exposed to traumatic events. So that is a partnership with, in our situation, with law enforcement. So Richland County Sheriff's Department and Columbia Police Department are two of our partners in the Columbia area school system. So all of the schools in Richland County School District 1. And then the school and community-based mental health, which again, Suzanne is the MTSS person for the Department of Ed. So we are all of those personnel that are going to be working with children to provide those wraparound support services. So this is a notification system based on collaboration. So we're going to start off a little bit by talking about trauma. So I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne for a few minutes, and then we'll talk a little bit more about Handle with Care and how it all relates.
Okay, so if you can either use your phone and do the QR code, or if you're familiar with Jamboard, you should be able to I'm going to put this link in the chat just in case, because I never knew if it works. And if y'all want to participate and just add, you can when you click on it, you can do a sticky note and you can add what you think trauma is. I'm just going to start it off. And then just a couple of y'all, if y'all want to do that. Just real quick. So trauma has a negative impact on children. Generational. What do you know about trauma? If y'all,
if it's easier for folks, you can put it in the chat and I can read it.
You can put it in the chat. Yep. Situations that children need help to process with, process and deal with. Right. Perfect. Very common after COVID. Yeah. Okay. Comes in a variety of forms. Perfect. Trauma is the consequence of a disturbing event. Okay. Perfect. Thank y'all.
Great. Holler at me when you want the slides back.
Yeah, if you want to switch it.
Okay.
Okay. So what do you know about trauma? So if y'all go through these, true or false, less than half of the adults report experiencing an instance of trauma during childhood.
How many of y'all think that that is true? You think it's true? Okay, how many of you think it's false? Okay. Couple of falses, couple of truths. Got it.
Okay. So it is false. So it is more than half. We're going to go over some statistics. It's actually 60% of adults report at least one traumatic experience as a child. So, wow. I mean, I know, to me, that's, every time I read that, that's alarming. Number two, trauma does not influence developmental milestones, true or false?
Mm-hmm. Everybody said false.
Yeah, it's false. So, yes, young children exposed to 5 or more significant adverse experiences in the first 3 years of life face a 76% likelihood of having 1 or more delays in their language, emotional, or brain development. And then finally, number 3, true or false, trauma has relatively little impact on life outcomes.
False, false, false.
Yeah, false, of course. People who have experienced trauma are 15 times more likely to attempt suicide, 4 times more likely to become an alcoholic, 4 times more likely to develop a sexually transmitted disease, 4 times more likely to inject drugs, 3 times more likely to use antidepressant medication and be absent from work, and likely to experience experience depression, and 3 times more likely to have serious job problems, 2.5 times more likely to smoke, 2 times more likely to develop chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and 2 times more likely to have serious financial problems. So that's some of the things that trauma does.
I'm putting some of the stuff in
Okay.
the chat for anybody who wants to see it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we threw this slide in here because after we looked at everything, there wasn't, or maybe people were going to talk about it, but the topic was not trauma. So all of us in this field are doing some type of trauma-informed care. And the more you know about it, the better. So the shift is from what is wrong with you to what happened to you. And of course, trauma-informed care is the acknowledgement that traumatic events, including adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, can result in problems with behavior and chronic health. And an element of trauma-informed care is avoiding a fear response in children. So changing that to, if you're approaching a child or an adult, is what happened to you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next slide. So just talking about some statistics. I love statistics and it puts things into perspective. So this is taken from the CDC vital signs, and it's going over, it's from the adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. And you can read in here, 1 in 6 adults experience 4 or more types of ACEs. 5 of 10, at least 5 of the top 10 leading causes of death are associated with ACEs. Just reading some of the statistics, 44% preventing ACEs could reduce the number of adults with depression by as much as 44%. That's pretty significant in my opinion, just knowing how many people deal with depression. Mm-hmm. And just talking about, like, employers, for example, adopt and support family-friendly policies such as paid family leave and flexible work schedules. That can do, when we're talking about P4 handle with care, just that in general can cut down on some of the stress with families. And then you're looking at decreasing heavy drinking, smoking, some of the socioeconomic challenges as far as like with unemployment and financial issues, things like that. So that's on the CDC's website, and you can search adverse childhood experiences to find that information.
I'm curious to know how many, since we have a small group, I'm hoping y'all will thank you for the interaction in the chat. How many of you have heard of ACEs or are fairly familiar with the ACEs study?
That's a great question, Megan.
Yeah, I'm just curious. Okay, Ashley, yes, okay. All right, anyone else familiar with ACEs? No, okay, thank you.
Okay.
That's helpful, okay. And so one of the things that, and we can certainly send anyone information if they want more, but this information is basically the kind of the core of why we're doing what we're doing, because so I work with the Center for Disability Resources. So we work with kids and adults who have a variety of different forms of disability. And what we know is that children who are exposed to traumatic experiences are also more likely to end up in special education programs because it physically changes the brain and how the brain works. And so it's important for us to identify those children early so that we can put those sort of resiliency factors in place for those kids. And so one thing that Suzanne and I have kind of noticed as we've been doing this project and talking with educators, and my husband is a public school teacher in Lexington one. And so I've noticed that a lot of the teachers don't know what ACEs are. And so I think there are, maybe our social workers, our counselors, our resource specialists, those folks may have some idea of what ACEs are, but a lot of our classroom teachers, we found that they just they've never been exposed to it. It wasn't part of their curriculum. They weren't taught it. But when we have done professional development with teachers, we've asked them to do their own ACEs. And if anyone is interested in that, it's a very simple, straightforward 10-question questionnaire. And it's a yes or no. It's not a kind of, sort of, well, maybe this happened to me like once. It's a yes or no. But what we have found is when the teachers have done the ACEs for themselves, it's been extremely eye-opening because it also answers some questions about how and why they are responding to situations in the classroom. Because if you think about the effect of trauma on your brain, and again, this wasn't necessarily a trauma presentation, but it all connects. We know that when we are in a traumatic situation, our brain doesn't process information. So I'm guilty of this too. When I have a kid who is dysregulated because of a traumatic experience, I'm a talker. I want them to talk to me. And what the research shows is they physically can't, because that part of their brain shuts down when they are in trauma. And so those are things we have to know so that we can support children. But it's also things that as educators, we need to know what our own trauma scores are, because it will affect how we react to those kids. And so just to kind of tie in why we're talking about ACEs, it really is the foundation of a lot of what we're doing. And so for folks who are not familiar with it, we are more than happy to send information about the project, but also about ACEs if you want it.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Megan, because if you take it, I mean, it's, for example, if you, between the birth and 18, if your parents were divorced, if you were in a disaster, if there was a sickness,
someone
dies, frequent moving, experiencing food insecurity, someone in your family was in prison, all those things negatively affect the child's brain development, immune system, and their stress response system.
Yep.
So, just talking about how it affects children's attention, decision making, and learning.
Yep.
And then it can become like children growing up with toxic stress.
Yeah.
And may have difficulty forming healthy and stable relationships. So it all ties together, unfortunately. But the good thing about it is don't think it's so grim, because it can be changed. You can definitely change that.
And when we look at our ACEs scores, and we'll move into the other stuff, but the impact is incredible. 3 is kind of our threshold. So 3 out of 10 is sort of our resiliency threshold. Again, not to say that we can't come back. It's sort of that idea of early intervention, right? But an ACEs score of 4 or higher has significant impact in health outcomes for individuals. The ACEs does not take into consideration the generational trauma because it was done, the actual research was done quite a while ago. But it does take into account sort of compounding trauma. And the ACEs score of 6 or higher is statistically shown to shave 20 years off of your life. So if you have an ACEs score of 6 or higher, you have literally shaved 20 years off your life. That's how serious this can be for folks. And so knowing that is important so we can recognize and not address so much the behavior, but why it's occurring. Why are kids not learning? Why are we seeing dysregulation in the classroom? So
it has been heavily linked to heart disease, causes people to have heart attacks. So
I think you already talked about this, but go ahead.
Yeah. So South Carolina ACEs scores. So this is from Children's Trust, and Children's Trust the Department of Education partners with Children's Trust, and they provide ACEs training. So train the trainer or to train you on ACEs. So you could contact Children's Trust, and they're holding trainings all the time and will come out and do trainings or virtual trainings. So 62% of South Carolina adults have reported 1 ACE as a child. 22% of South Carolina adults reported 2 or more ACEs, and 16% of South Carolina reported 4 or more. So with those statistics, 16% is, it may not seem a lot, but like Megan said, putting that into perspective of the having 4 of 10, that's something to take note of. And then some types, like I was talking about, like what you're looking at: divorce, separation, emotional abuse, substance abuse, domestic violence, mental illness, physical abuse, sexual abuse, incarceration. So again, those are just some statistics, and you can find that on the Children's Trust website. Does anybody have any questions about the ACEs?
You can put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself if you prefer. No questions? Okay. All right. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about Handle with Care. So as I mentioned in the beginning, Handle with Care is a national movement that started in 2013 in West Virginia, and it was in response to the opioid epidemic there. So they were noticing kids who were having very high ACE scores, who were not learning, who were being kind of shuffled into special education classrooms. And they were trying to figure out what was going on for those children. And so what they did in 2013, Chief Holbrook, who is now at Columbia Police Department, was in West Virginia at that time. And he implemented a process in his department where the SROs would be looking at these reports. When law enforcement would respond to a situation, they would take note of whether or not there was a child present. And then that child, if there was a child present, the police department would communicate with the school resource officers to identify that child, and to hopefully ensure that there are folks that kind of have laid eyes on that kid, that student, with a different lens to identify that something happened. And so now when Chief Holbrook came to Columbia about 7 years ago, we tried to get this project started for the state of South Carolina. And to be honest, I think it was just not the right time for that. But it was definitely a conversation that started at that point. And so what ended up happening is there were lots of people kind of talking behind the scenes about it. And if you are interested in more information on the national Handle with Care, it is housed at the West Virginia Center for Children's Justice. And basically, the mission of Handle with Care is to promote safe and supportive homes, schools, and communities that protect children and help traumatized children heal and thrive. And again, thrive is that key there. We want to build resiliency, and we know it's possible. So these are some. This was updated in 2020, so I think well, I know South Carolina wasn't on it, so there's definitely an updated map that they need to publish. But this just kind of shows where some of these Handle with Care implementation sites are. And then this is the national protocol, and South Carolina has adopted something very similar, but we have a slight twist in Richland County. So what usually happens is the law enforcement officer goes out to a call, responds to a call, could be anything. Suzanne mentioned a couple of different things that could be potential traumatic events for children. So they could respond to a car accident where a child was present. They might respond to a domestic violence call. They might respond to a gun violence call. They might respond to someone, a death in a family, or some kind of other traumatic situation. And what we're asking them to do, and what the national protocol says, is take note that there's a child present and give us information about that kid, so we know that they saw something. For example, in a domestic violence situation, a lot of times the person who is the victim in those situations will be offered victim's assistance. So if whoever that person is usually the target of the intervention. And so that's an adult most times in the situations I'm talking about. And so, but we don't realize there's a 6-year-old that watched this. And so that 6-year-old isn't necessarily identified as a victim in that situation. With the Handle with Care protocols, we're identifying that child as well. Even though they may not have been physically injured, they saw something that changed their life. And so that referral goes from law enforcement to the school. And I'll talk about our P4 in a minute, and all that's told to them is that the child witnessed a traumatic event, that we ask that whoever has direct contact with that child, school, teacher, principal, guidance counselor. In one of our schools, it really is the assistant principal. She's phenomenal. But whoever that is, that they just understand that child needs to be, quote unquote, handled with care. We don't necessarily know what happened. That's usually the first thing they want to know, what happened. To be honest, it kind of doesn't matter, because the result is the same. It's a trauma. We need to respond to the fact that the child experienced a trauma. And so what we hope is to build more trauma responsive school practices. And instead of saying this child's having behavior, we're looking at, why is this occurring? What's going on here? And it doesn't have to be a disruptive behavior. Maybe it's a child who comes in and falls asleep, or who starts to withdraw. There's lots of reactions that we might be seeing in the classroom, and we want to understand where it's coming from. So it's, again, I think Suzanne mentioned in the beginning, it's about asking the why. What's going on here? And so the school district gets that. They give the information to whomever needs to have it. And then it may be that there is no follow-up needed, that the school is handling that, or it may be that they get someone else involved, like the school counselor or social worker, and they reach out and see if the family needs additional support services. But we want to make sure that there's sort of that wraparound support for that child and that family. So in South Carolina, what we did, so again, credit to Chief Holbrook for sure. We started what we call the P4 project, which is the Palmetto Pyramid Police Partnership, in August of 2021. So we are just over a year or so in implementation with this. And we have, in the state of South Carolina, we have 19 school districts now who are participating in Handle with Care in some form. So there are a couple of different projects going on that are not necessarily affiliated with P4, but they're doing Handle with Care. And some of the upstate regions are working with some folks at DHEC and Department of Mental Health. But with P4, what we are doing is specifically working with Richland County School District 1 All of the Handle with Care notifications come into an email system that is located at my office. And we have designated folks who will take those referrals and respond. So our process is we get the referral, we get information from either Richland County Sheriff's Department or Columbia Police Department. We will then find, if this child is school aged, we find out who the social worker is for that school. We actually have an agreement, a memo of understanding with Richland County School District 1, Department of Education, and the School of Medicine to collaboratively work on this. But we get the referral, we call the school social worker because that's the process that they've put in place. We let them know we got a referral on the child, and we ask them to make sure that the folks that are working with that child know to handle with that child experienced something and he needed to be handled with care. That in some situations, the social worker might ask us for some additional resources that they can offer to the family. So we've done some asset mapping in that Richland 1 area where we can identify, who takes certain insurance, if they want additional supports for therapy. It may be just sending them some information on trauma or on ACEs or just kind of awareness of what we're looking for. And then they may or may not ask us for additional follow-up. We've had situations where there's been a child who is exposed to maybe a sexual assault, and we know that there may be some additional supports from the police department, victims assistance. And so we also will try to make sure that if there is an additional support in place, that the social worker can connect with that additional support person so that there is kind of a continuity of care for that child. And so that everyone's kind of making sure that that child does not fall through the cracks. So this is our process. This is our team. So you've met me and Suzanne. Rikki McCormick is one of our consultants. She was one of our project leads and lives in West Virginia and brought a lot of this to us because she worked with Chief Holbrook in West Virginia. And so she is on a part-time consulting basis with us now. And so she was the initial person you probably saw on your list. And then we have some social work interns that work with us that are supervised in my office. And these are social work students who are from Columbia College, Winthrop University, and the University of South Carolina in their social work programs. And they do a lot of the hands-on work with one of our particular pilot schools and go in and are working with kids that the school has identified who have been exposed to traumatic experiences. And they're doing psychoeducational groups with those children. And so they're working on things like self-regulation. They're working on identifying feelings. They may be working on some other resiliency factors. They might be working on helping the teacher in the classroom understand a little bit more about how to respond to a particular child. And this, again, can't thank our assistant principal at one of our pilot schools enough. She's been amazing. But the school itself identified 30 children last year, and those were not children we had police reports on. So again, P4 is slightly different because this is a situation where law enforcement may not have ever been called, but this school knows their kids, knows their students well enough to know who's had these experiences. Our youngest in our small groups is 4, and the oldest is, I think, 11, so pre-K through 5th grade. As far as our Handle with Care referrals, the youngest referral we've had is a child who was 18 months old, who witnessed some domestic violence situations, and we've had all the way up to 21. The particular grant that created this particular project is geared towards young children, which is why the pyramid model is part of this. So looking at social emotional learning for young children. However, If we get a referral on a child that is older, we don't discount that. We still want to make sure that we follow up on that. So we also have a steering committee. Our steering committee is incredible. We have lots of different folks represented, really wanting to make sure that we have the right people to kind of look at what we're doing and advise us. So we have folks from early childhood, we have an education policy attorney, because a lot of what we're looking at has to do with expulsion and suspension of kids because of behavioral issues. And we can trace a lot of those things back into a traumatic experience for a child. We have Family Connection of South Carolina, which is a parent-to-parent advocacy organization for folks, families with children with disabilities, infant mental health, First Steps, Department of Social Services, alcohol and drug organizations. We have a couple of professors doing some research on trauma or trauma-informed practice that are part of that, obviously Department of Ed. So again, we really are very deliberate in how we are structuring the folks that are working on this advisory group with us to make sure that we are capitalizing on expertise that we know is out there. So that is kind of our steering committee. I'm going to pause there for a second and see if anyone has any questions about what we've talked about. I think we go until 10:50, and I've got 10:30. So I just wanted to pause for a second and see if anyone has any questions that you might have as we're talking.
And I put the website and the link to the chat in the chat.
Thank you. So, and if there are questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll watch it as we go. So the Handle with Care, what are the goals of Handle with Care and P4? Consistent communication with the notices. So making sure that kids don't fall through the cracks. And we have, I think there are the 19 districts that are doing this. That's the first thing they do is create the notification. So where does the notification system come in? So Richland 2, for example, has a notification system for Handle with Care. Those referrals don't come to us, they go directly to the director of social work. There are occasions where we will get a referral because perhaps Columbia Police Department responded to something and the child that was involved happened to be in Richland 2. So we will then contact that Richland 2 person and let them know that we got a referral on a child in their district. And then she will contact the social worker and the principal or whoever they've designated as the appropriate person to make sure that folks know that child had an experience. Some of the areas in the upstate have a different process. Their referral process goes directly to one of their SROs, and the SRO is then responsible for contacting someone in the schools. So again, how they do it, as long as it is ensuring that there's consistent communication and that those referrals get disseminated, we're not mandating how that happens because each school district is different and they have their own culture. Collaboration with law enforcement and first responders, again, very important. Making sure that they know to identify a child in that situation. So sort of looking at their response a little differently. And that we have some great training that was created for SROs specifically around trauma as part of the grant funding that we have. So the Pyramid Consortium has created several different modules, and one is very specific to law enforcement. And it was done by law enforcement. So we wanted to make sure that they understand what we want them to do and why it's important. Building capacity within the classroom, again, helping teachers understand how to look at things through a trauma lens. And that may be things like creating safe spaces in a classroom, a calming corner. If you have a child that is dysregulated because they have had significant trauma, is the classroom overwhelming for them? Is whatever on the walls, is it too much? How are we going to give that child space to regulate? And how are we going to notice when they are dysregulated? Because a child's dysregulation might be different depending on what what that child's personality is. You might have a kid who just puts his head down and disengages. You might have another kid who's flipping desks. It really just depends. And so how are we helping those educators in the classroom build capacity and look at what they need to support those students? And then involving community. So I noticed when you all signed in of who you are, we've got some pretty unique folks on just involved in this, you know, communities and schools, assistant principal, you know, what was it, multilingual learner program. So again, I think, you know, it's not just one person's responsibility, and it's also not meant to add something to someone's plate. It's about doing what you already do within a different lens. And so really making sure that we're building that community and knowing who do we call when we need some additional support for a child. Suzanne mentioned that Children's Trust does ACEs training. That's a great way to start, so folks know what it is. So again, building that community is important. So a lot of the way we do that is establishing the protocols, defining who's doing what. So what are the roles? What are the expectations for that particular district? What is the physical space that is needed? So whether it's in a classroom, whether it's, you know, we have the students in our P4 project are going in and doing small groups once a week with small groups of students. And they've provided just a safe classroom space for us to do that, where the kids can kind of come and work on some things with us. And then how do we assess where our capacity is? We have some amazing educators and professionals in our school districts. And so how do we capitalize on that? Some of the best responders I've seen in some of the schools I've worked with are folks that we maybe wouldn't have necessarily thought. I had a school custodian who literally probably was one of the most impactful people for one of our children, because he just provided a really great, strong role model for that particular student. And so it's building that trauma-informed and trauma-responsive team, and it doesn't necessarily mean it's a title. It's a mindset. And then again, involving families and school communities. Some folks live in traumatic experience so much that they don't recognize that it's maybe not typical. So kind of just an understanding who our kids are and where they're coming from. And then just to kind of look at Maslow before Bloom, right? If a child's not fed and can't sleep and isn't able to feel safe, how are they going to learn, right? So we know that if those children don't have that basic groundwork of safety and security, the extra, right, the learning and the connecting can't happen. They can't process the material, and that's scientifically based. And so we've got lots of kids who are identified as having a disability and going into special education classes or resource classes when it's a traumatized brain situation, and we didn't recognize that, because we didn't know. So what we're hoping to do, a lot of what we're doing right now is in schools. What we are looking at expanding this to daycare settings. So right now we don't have a way to identify children in daycare unless that law enforcement person is asking if the child goes to daycare center. So when we're looking at identifying children under 4, it's because it's difficult for us. And so we're in the process of creating a database and a referral system or an alert system for daycare centers. And so we're hoping that we'll have that soon. And then figuring out, how do I identify kids who aren't in school and aren't in daycare? Where does that come from? How do we get in touch with them? How do we make sure that those folks are getting the support that they need? So the last thing I will leave with you is, does it work? And what we are seeing is, yes, it does. We are seeing a significant decrease in special education identification of children. decrease in exclusionary disciplines and behavioral referrals. We're seeing higher test scores and achievement norms for standardized assessments when we've implemented these things, and increased collaboration and supports within these districts. So we have a short video to show you. This is the school district in West Virginia that has implemented this. But before I show you that, I saw we have 10 minutes. So does anyone have any questions? We can certainly give you access to the video. If you have questions, I'd rather answer your questions. What happens if the student moves outside of the district to a district that does not have a program? Do you need parental consent to meet with the student? So great question. So what we do not have consent to talk with families. So right now, our process is that we work specifically within the school systems process in Richland 1. So if that child moves outside of the district, let's say, and to make sure I understand your question, if the child, let's say the child was in Richland 1, there was a traumatic experience, they were identified through a handle with care referral, and we told the school district that this child had a traumatic experience and they needed to be handled with care. And the Richland 1 identified that and covered their protocols. And then the child moves to Orangeburg, for example. I think your question is, would Orangeburg then be notified that something happened with that child? Okay, so it's a great question. I will say it depends. There is nothing in our processes to say that should happen. However, if the child was already identified in Richland 1 and they were working on some things, my hope would be that in that transfer to that other district, someone would be talking about what, the fact that this child has perhaps has a trauma history. That's one of the reasons that we're very excited about seeing the expansion in Handle with Care in the state of South Carolina, because it means that more districts are aware that they need to be asking the questions about what are we seeing with these kids. So my answer, unfortunately, is it depends on the school. Do we need parental consent to meet with the student? Yes. So in the small groups that we're doing in the elementary school, yes, the school has identified some kids last year that they knew had traumatic experiences. Some of the children were in foster care or kinship care. Some of the children, they had lost family members due to COVID. This is a particularly lower socioeconomic status area and lots of gun violence, which is why it was identified by the Columbia Police Department in the first place. And so they knew a lot about some of the kids that were coming into their school anyway. And then they sent permission slips home to the families or guardians to ask if this child could participate. So that we do have consent for the small groups, yes. And what supports do we provide to the parent or guardian? Great question. Right now, that depends on the family and the school. So we are starting to do, again, we did this for 12 weeks at the end of the semester last year. So we are still piloting this. But what the plan is we've sent information home about trauma. We've sent information home to all of the parents about what we're doing, and hopefully encouraging them to ask questions. We have been talking with the assistant principal about being part of some of their open houses or some of their other events. I know Suzanne has been looking into, tabling events and community events that we can go to in that area so that folks understand what we want to do and the impact of trauma and what resources are out there. So we're still kind of working on that. And we realize it's important because a lot of the parents don't really understand a whole lot about trauma either. So hopefully I answered your question. Great. So does anyone else that have other questions or anything else that we can answer for you? I want to just be aware of our time. You're welcome to unmute yourselves if you have questions, or you can put them in the chat. I'm curious, I know that we've had some other people join us since we started, and so I'm curious about what districts, if y'all are with particular school districts, what districts you're with. You can put it in the chat or unmute. Just curious about how many of you have heard of Handle with Care or the P4 project. So, anybody?
I know Regina that was commented, she's in the office with me next door.
Oh,
She's the family engagement liaison with the South Carolina Department of Education.
Thank you.
She's the mastermind behind the summit.
Oh, wonderful.
I say that, Suzanne, but I really am glad that you're here, because one of the things that I'm looking at is really trying to push all of this information out. How do we share this information? It is so, the resources, the services, and making sure that not only our parents are aware, but how do we even help make the parent educators, our other school officials aware of such wonderful services and resources. This is incredible.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm seeing the question in the chat, and I think I asked you if you were familiar with ACEs in the very beginning. And so I'm curious to know if anyone had even heard about Handle with Care in your districts yet. I know a couple of you are from districts that were doing this, but, oh, great. Thanks, Ashley. And what district is that, Ashley?
We're in Richland too.
Thank you. Yeah, Abby Cobb.
Richland. Yes.
Yep, she's
And
my contact.
she may know about it.
Oh no, she does. She's my contact.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So.
Yep, Abby is amazing. She's our contact.
Yes.
Yep. So I'm going to share my screen one more time just so you guys have our contact information. I think they're giving you the PowerPoint, but just in case. If y'all have questions, you can certainly reach out to us, and we can send you information. We also have the website. Our information is also on the website. That we are more than happy to talk to y'all if you have questions, if you want some training on trauma, if you want some resources, we're more than happy to do that, and we're free. So there's that. And I will make sure, can we make sure that that folks get the link to the video, since we didn't have time to show it? Is that an
just
option?
throw it in the chat. Yeah.
Throw it in the chat. Okay, hold on.
If you have the link to it.
I will figure out the link to it.
And Suzanne will be back this afternoon presenting again as well. So feel free to come back and see her. But we thank you both. You did an amazing job. We are very much appreciative to have you here today.
Great. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it. And let me put the link in the chat. I think I got it. So for anyone who wants it, but we can certainly also share it. That should be the link.
It's a great video.
It is. It's really helpful. And again, I think it will answer some of your questions as well. But thank you all for your time. We appreciate it. And we're here if we can help.
Yep, the video follows along to Dr. Anderson's message. It just is so many people are doing so many great things for children.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Have a good one, y'all.